I am married and I have 3 children. I am separated from my wife, who lives in England with my children. I was born in Wigan, Lancashire, England. I came to Ireland about 2 years ago. On August 5th, 1976, I went to live with another English chap called Chris Outram at Fethard, County Tipperary. Geoffrey came to stay at Outram's on Friday, August 27th, 1976. I got the loan of a car from Frank Walsh of Fethard. Walsh is a friend of Outram's. The car was in Austin. Geoffrey and I left Fethard in the car on the Saturday and we drove to Dublin. We went there to collect suitcases of Geoffrey's at the railway station along the quays. We collected them about 4 or 5 in the evening. We had a meal in the city. We decided to go to British Bay of Wicklow and break into some caravans. Somewhere outside Arklow, we went into a pub on the main road and had a few drinks. I don't know the name of the place. We left it after a few drinks. We then drove on towards British Bay. We were talking about girls, and Geoffrey said he was going to pick up a bird and have it off with her. I have been cautioned by Detective Guarder Tom Connolly that I am not obliged to say anything unless I wish to do so, but that anything I do say will be taken down in writing and may be used in evidence.
On Saturday, the 28th of August 1976, a young lady from Dublin by the name of Elizabeth Plunkett went to McDaniel's pub down in British Bay with a group of friends for a night out.
Elizabeth Plunkett, who was 23, a very attractive young woman. She was a foreign currency clerk in Dublin and from Ringsend herself. She was out with a group of girlfriends enjoying a night out in McDaniel's pub, which is near the caravan park in British Bay, and a popular pub for groups of Dubliners who were going out to the country.
McDaniel's was at that time a very popular pub for holidaymakers, and it was in full swing at that time of the year. During the course of the night in McDaniel's, a dispute arose between Elizabeth Plunkett and her boyfriend, and Elizabeth decided to leave. And that's the last that she was seen alive.
As Elizabeth left McDaniel's and began walking away, she was passed out by a number of people who would later help Gardaí piece together her last movements.
She was walking down towards Arklow. He passed her out. Geoff stopped and I got out. He turned the car and went back and picked up the girl. He then picked me up. I sat in the back and the girl in the front seat. She was wearing pants and a jumper with writing on it.
They picked Elizabeth Plunkett up on the pretext of giving her a lift. That night was a foul one in Wicklow. It had been raining very, very heavily. Elizabeth Plunkett got into the car, but she quickly became suspicious. But before she could escape, they fell upon her and beat her savagely. They took her in the car to Castletown Wood. There she underwent an unimaginable ordeal.
We drove to the woods with her. She told us she had a row with her boyfriend. She started to scream in the car, and we stuffed tissues into her mouth. When we got to the wood, we dragged her out of the car.
While Elizabeth was being taken into the woods, her boyfriend Damien Bush began to look for her. After driving around British Bay and Wicklow Town, he drove back to Dublin to see if she had shown up at her sister's house. Unable to find her, he returned to British Bay and shortly later informed her father and the Gardaí about her disappearance. It was now Sunday, the 29th of August.
As a result of her, she not turning up at home, her disappearance was reported to Gardaí. And for the next week or so, there was a search organised around that area to see whether any trace of her or any of her belongings or anything could be found.
The following Monday, a chance meeting occurred which would turn out crucial in the search for the missing girl.
Monday morning, or Monday afternoon, a detective Garda from Wicklow was around British Bay, and he saw two men, unknown to him. They had a fire lighting on the side of the road somewhere, and he spoke to them. He took their names. One man gave the name Geoffrey Murphy, and the other man said that he was Geoffrey's brother. And they had an Austin Farina car, which the detective Garda took the number of, and the men told him that they were staying with a Chris Outram down in Feathered. The Garda done a great job. He took all these particulars down in his notebook. At the time, he did not know, or it was not generally known, that Elizabeth Plunkett was missing. So after some days, in a wood, not too far from McDaniel's, maybe half a mile or so, a shoe, lady's shoe, and a watch were found and identified by the family. Certainly the watch has been Elizabeth Plunkett's watch, and that the shoe they thought was hers as well. So search continued in that area, and there was two important discoveries made really in relation to the crime. It was a pair of black boots, size 6, with steel tips at the heels, and the tips were kept in place by brass screws, which was unusual. As well as that, there was a label found with the name Geoffrey Murphy was found in the immediate vicinity. After these articles being found in the wood, the Garda decided that it was very suspicious, and the chances are that Elizabeth Plunkett had been abducted. So it was an investigation group put together. At the time, I was stationed in Naas as a detective Garda, and I went, I was asked to go, or told to go, to Wicklow to assist in the investigations over there with a number of others, and joined up with the investigation section from Garda headquarters.
After news had circulated through the search party that Elizabeth Plunkett's belongings, the boots and the label with the name Murphy had been found, Detective Joseph Nealon informed his fellow officers about the two men he had spoken to by the fire.
We were there for 3 or 4 days when it was discovered that the Garda, the late Garda, Detective Garda Joe Nealon, that these men were worthy of investigation.
The search for Elizabeth Plunkett continued, while the whereabouts of these two men remained unknown. Who were these suspicious characters? The Gardaí knew they had to work fast before any trace was lost.
We stayed on around the caravan park until sometime late that night or Tuesday morning. We then returned to Fethard. While we were there, we'd done a few strokes. We stayed there till September 10th, 76, and Chris drove us to Limerick. We came on to Salt Hill then, and we bought a caravan. We stayed in this caravan. We pinched a car in Clifton. Jeff pinched it, not me. A few days after that, we were in Castlebar one night. It was about 12 o'clock. Jeff was driving.
My name is Porrick Lyons. Been living in Castlebar all my life. We, after getting married in 1975, we lived in Lakeshore Drive for just over 20 years, and we moved to the Orchard in 1997. Castlebar in 1976 was a nice, progressive little town, but, you know, since the boom time and the Celtic Tigers come along, it has really expanded out. Each road you go, there's hundreds of houses now compared to what it used to be at in 1976.
Castlebar in the mid-70s was a quiet, pretty quiet town. Like, there was a crime-free town, I would say, really. You know, a good town for employment and, you know, a pretty decent town. Like, people would leave their doors open at that time in certain estates. You know, there was no need. Crime wasn't an issue.
Porrick and Cyril were unaware that they would become key witnesses to the events that would unfold that Wednesday night, the 22nd of September.
I was at the cinema in Westport with my mother and my girlfriend, and when I arrived home to drive into my driveway, I noticed a car across the driveway. It was completely unusual because no one ever parked, for all the years I lived there, ever parked across my driveway. So I'm seeing the car there. I pulled in behind it and had a look into the car to see who it was, because I knew it wasn't any neighbour's car or anything like that. So I had a look at the two gents in the car, and I wrote down the number and the make of the car. And I went in home then, and I made a cup of tea, and then I brought my girlfriend home, but the car was gone. So probably half an hour after I had first seen it, when I came out to bring my girlfriend home, the car had gone.
At that time, there was a program on the television that most people were watching called Roots, about the slavery in America. So I decided to go into the local pub and watch it, have a couple of pints. So at about 11:15, it was over, so I headed for home. Went in the door and went up the stairs, and the next thing I heard this awful scream. So I shouted down to Mary. I said, "Did you hear that?" So Mary went to the front door and saw a car pulling off. But we thought no more of it until we heard about the abduction the next day. It was just like a female in trouble, you know, high-pitched kind of a scream. But it never dawned on us that anything like that had happened until we heard it the next day.
We saw a girl on the road walking along. Geoff stopped the car. I got out and went over to the girl.
1976, I was just finishing primary school and moving into secondary school, and I guess it was also one of the hottest summers ever. 76. It was one of those summers that it just broke all records in the summertime, and in the wintertime it was one of the coldest winters ever. So it was a kind of a weird year, you know, a very for any 11-year-old child, kind of just. It's just one of those kind of landmark things that stand out in your life.
I grabbed a hold of her and dragged her to the car.
Mary Duffy was working as a waitress in the Wimpy bar close to the County Telegraph offices here. It was a burger bar, and she worked there with several other girls. It was a very busy place because there were very few cafes as such in the town at that particular time, and it was a regular meeting place for quite a lot of people, and all the journalists here used to go there on a regular basis, and we knew Mary. She was a lovely girl, very helpful, very pleasant, and as I said, the shock of it just numbed everybody.
She started to scream. I pulled her into the back of the car and sat beside her. She told me her name was Mary.
Mary Duffy finished work in the Wimpy bar late on that particular night, around 11:30, maybe coming up to 12 o'clock. She telephoned her brother, or her home, to get her brother to come and collect her, as he normally would. As it so happened, he was gone somewhere else in the car, dropping somebody else home somewhere. And she was told that when he come back, he'd go and collect her. So in the meantime, she started to walk.
They must have been watching the kiosk across the road where she was making her phone call from. Mary Duffy made a phone call from a kiosk across the road, and that kiosk was visible from my driveway.
I think my first memory of Mary Duffy was, I think she worked in a shop on Castle Street, which was just below the boxing club, a place called Stewart's. And it was a little shop that I remember you walked down these kind of rounded steps, and you kind of walked down into the shop, and then when you got to the shop, you stepped down another level, and it was a tiny little shop, and Mary was there, and there was a 99 machine there. And so, you know, lots of kids spent time in there, you know.
Please, please!
She wasn't gone too far when two men, apparently Sean Evans, pulled up beside her in the car. One of them got out, dragged her back to the car, put her into the car. During the struggle, she screamed and she lost a set of dentures, which were subsequently found a day or two afterwards and identified by her dentist as being belonged to Mary Duffy.
Because at the time I used to work up in a place called the Royal Ballroom, which is still there, the Traveller's Friend, and I worked in the ladies' cloakroom hanging up their coats. So my job basically was hang up the coats and give them out at the end of the evening, you know. But Mary used to come quite often on a Sunday night. She'd come about 11:45. I remember when she came up to the hatch, she was like, a hatch was like one of these, the hatch was there, it's almost like everyone was in a portrait picture, you know, anybody who came kind of presented themselves, you only seen their tops of their heads and their shoulders, really, you know. And I was a kid kind of looking up, so I used to grab the stuff and bring it down, you know. She always had time for me, and she wouldn't do it like in a way, oh, there's a little kid working in the cloakroom way, but in a way where as a human being. And I used to be able to joke with her and have fun with her, and you know, and she spent more time there than she probably was necessary, you know, because she was out her night out and she worked so hard. And but I always something about her that struck me, and I almost there was, you know, when someone's got a real sense of humanity in them, a real sense of goodness, it shows through.
When Mary's brother arrived to collect her, he couldn't find her. And as time went on, she couldn't be found. And her disappearance was reported to the Gardaí next morning. And a search organised for her went on for a number of days. She couldn't be found. Her disappearance and that of Elizabeth Plunkett were sort of very unusual incidents in Ireland at the time. And it was thought that perhaps the same people were involved. And the search was intensified for those two people that Joe Nealon had spoken to in British Bay.
As the search and investigation continued in British Bay, a number of eyewitnesses came forward to help Gardaí piece together Elizabeth's last known movements. When a woman arrived at McDaniel's with her husband to pick up their son who had been working there that night, she saw Elizabeth leave the pub on her own. Shortly later, another motorist saw Elizabeth walking away from McDaniel's. He spotted a car that was driving in the opposite direction stop and pick up Elizabeth.
When we got to the wood, we dragged her out of the car. We climbed over a wire fence that was across the road there. We went into the woods with her. We had a hold of her. We put her to lie down, and she did so.
Suspicions arose about the two men Detective Nealon had encountered the day after Elizabeth's disappearance. These two men now became the focus of the investigation. Based on the information Detective Nealon had obtained, Gardaí travelled to Fethard to question Chris Outram as to the whereabouts of Geoffrey Murphy and his supposed brother. With them, they had the boots that had been found in the woods, the boots with the unusual brass screws.
So a few of us went down to Tipperary, down to Clonmel, where we went to see Chris Outram. Detective Inspector at the time, John Courtney, was in the group, and we interviewed Outram. The shoes or the boots were produced to him, and when he saw them, he says, "Oh, they're Geoffrey Evans's boots." He says, I recognise them, he says, because I repaired them for him in the prison in Dublin. So he then told the Gardaí that on Saturday, the 28th, the day that Elizabeth Plunkett was abducted from outside McDaniel's, that Geoffrey Evans's pal, a fellow by the name of John Shaw, borrowed a car from his friend, Outram's friend, and they went to Dublin. And they were away for a couple of days. And he says they came back here on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and they decided to leave. And he says he drove them to Limerick on the 10th of September, and he didn't know where they were after that.
From this one piece of evidence, Gardaí now had the true identity of the two men they had been looking for, Englishmen John Shaw and Geoffrey Evans. Evidence now speculatively put them in and around the location where Elizabeth was last seen.
The investigation into Elizabeth Plunkett's disappearance continued for a number of weeks. In and around Feathered, in case they'd return, and in and around British Bay. Their description was circulated throughout the force, and it appeared in the media.
In the weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, Shaw and Evans tried to lay low in the west of Ireland. On the 14th of September, the two men approached the Barna Caravan Park caretaker in order to buy a caravan. They purchased one for £380 and for the receipt gave the names Roy Hall and David Ball. 1 week later, they moved the caravan to a quieter part of the park. The following day, Evans stole a 1970 Fern Green Ford Cortina in Clifton. In order to evade Gardaí, they hand-painted it black and changed the number plates.
It was a black box-shaped Cortina with a Dublin registration, and to me it seemed to have been hand-painted. Like, it didn't look like a finished product of paint, you know what I mean, like a garage spray car. It seemed to have been hand-painted, that's all I can say, you know.
With a nationwide investigation underway, numerous sightings of the peculiar Englishmen were reported to Gardaí, but Shaw and Evans had still managed to evade capture. Unaware that the Gardaí were closing in on them, the two men travelled to Castlebar late at night on the 22nd of September. It was on this night that Mary Duffy began the 20-minute walk home to Belcarra after work, expecting to be collected by her brother along the way. She never arrived home.
Mary Duffy was reported missing in around the 20th of September in 1976. Her disappearance was suspicious, and there was an alert sent out to keep an eye out for her.
I just heard about the abduction of Mary Duffy when I went into work the next morning. So when I inquired about what time was it at, and they said about 11:25. So then I decided I'd go to the barracks to see could I be of any assistance to them, just to tell them what I had heard. So the guards took my statement, and about an hour later they came to my place of work to go over it and see could I add anything further to it. And I just told them I was sorry I couldn't. I just heard the scream and my wife saw the car pulling off.
A team of 60 Gardaí are now engaged in the search. Many of them have been drafted into Castlebar from outlying districts. They've been calling on householders in the town, asking if they saw the girl or can give any information that might help to locate her. And they've appealed to townspeople to come forward if they think they can help. Miss Duffy was last seen leaving the coffee shop in Castlebar's Ellison Street last Wednesday night at 11 o'clock. From there, she walked to a phone booth at the junction of McHale Road and Ball Road. After leaving the phone booth, she probably walked along the Brafey Road towards her home 5 miles away, but she never arrived.
We all heard about the Mary Duffy missing, like a few days after that. But it was only when a Detective Jim Bohan, came around making inquiries in the area did we see anything unusual on that particular night. So first of all, it didn't register with me, first of all, because as I said, it was crime-free in Castlebar, really. And then just as Detective Bohan was leaving, I remembered, I better tell him about the car. That was unusual to be parked outside my house. And the two gents that was in it. So that was it. He came in and then took statements. And
she was only just reported, but as time went on, the authorities connected the two. There was Elizabeth Plunkett's disappearance and Mary Duffy's disappearance or something similar.
About 2 days after Mary Duffy disappeared, a publican in Manbridge, in Connemara, he also had petrol pumps. Two men, Englishmen, as he said, drove in and got petrol. He told him, he had read the papers, he had read about the description of the two Englishmen that were missing, or that were wanted, the two Englishmen that were wanted in relation to the disappearance of two girls. And took the number of their car, and he noted it was a Ford car, and it was hand-painted black. And he noted the number down in some document in the pub, and the following day he reported it to the guards. Now, it was a big search, and this sighting of this car and the number was circulated again throughout the force. The following Sunday night, which was the 26th of September, it was the night of the All-Ireland football final. The Dublin defeated Kerry. I remember it well. That night, at 11:30, Jim Boland, Garda Jim Boland, and Garda Corcoran of Salt Hill, they saw the car parked in the promenade near a hotel. So they kept it under observation, and they contacted the Gardaí in Galway for assistance.
PJ Corcoran and myself, we were working in Salt Hill that night. Early that night, PJ and I, we were in the patrol car, and we said that we'd have to keep an eye out for those two English guys, that it'd be terrible if they were living in our area and we didn't know it. That night, I was driving the patrol car. PJ Corcoran was the observer. We were driving from Barna into Salt Hill. There was a disco on in the Ocean Wave hotel in Salt Hill. That was the first disco that was in Galway. There was a lot of cars parked outside it. We decided that we'd check the cars on both sides of the road. PJ was checking on the left-hand side, and I was checking on the right-hand side. As we went down the street, I noticed this car that we were looking for. We went down the street a little bit. We decided that PJ go to the station to ring Galway for help. We didn't want to talk over the radio to the station because a lot of youngsters around the place had walkie-talkies and they were listening to our messages. PJ decided to go down to the station and I drove up a laneway up towards Seamount. I parked the car up there and I could see the car down on the promenade. PJ was only gone a short time when two men came from the direction of the hotel where the disco was on, and I went into the car. So therefore, there was only just had to make up our mind there and then. I decided to tell the Galway car over the radio, come to Salt Hill as quick as you can. The two men got into the car and I was driving down. They couldn't pull out until I passed. I left the headlights on, full headlights. They were waiting for me to pass. I was in touch with the Galway car and I was asking them where they were. In the end, they said, "We're behind you now." I said, "When I get out of the car," I said to the Galway lads, "When I get out of the car, I'll catch the driver and let you catch the passenger." I got out of the car, caught the driver. PJ and the Galway lads caught the passenger. They were caught just like that.
They were brought to Eglinton Street Garda Station and they were detained for possession of a stolen car.
Shaw and Evans, who had told Garda Boland their names were Hall and Ball, were moved from Salt Hill Station to Eglinton Street 1 hour after they were arrested. They were detained in their cells until early the next morning, when a series of interviews were conducted. The Gardaí interrogated the suspects until they revealed their true identities and criminal past.
Geoffrey Evans and John Shaw were both in their 30s when they arrived in Ireland in 1974. They were already on the run. They were wanted for questioning in the UK in connection with 3 savage sexual assaults which had happened to women in and around the Manchester area where they were from. John Shaw was a former miner. He was powerfully built, dark, brooding individual. He already had 26 previous convictions, including 2 for sexual assault. Geoffrey Evans was the more intelligent of the 2. He also had a string of convictions as long as your arm. He had spent a considerable amount of time in prison already. He was the more cunning and he was the dominant figure in their evil partnership.
Shaw and Evans came to Ireland on the run from the English police. In order to support themselves here, their criminal tendencies began once again.
They needed 2 things. They needed money and they needed transport. To that end, they travelled down to Wicklow and carried out a number of burglaries, mostly on households. But the burglaries were bungled and they were quickly caught by the Gardaí, brought to the courts, convicted and sent to prison. Now, at this stage, the British authorities heard about their arrest and the fact that they were in prison, and they began to initiate extradition proceedings against them. Now, at that time, the height of the Troubles, extradition proceedings in Ireland were notoriously fraught. Mostly they were initiated to bring back suspected INLA and IRA terrorists for terrorist offences which had occurred in British territories. But the British police had pretty substantial evidence against Shaw and Evans in relation to the sexual assaults which had happened in and around Manchester, including fingerprint evidence. One would have thought that that should have been it. But when the case was heard in the Bridewell, it quickly became clear that the courts were demanding cast iron evidence before they were going to allow Shaw and Evans to be extradited back to the UK. And the extradition process failed. Shaw and Evans were released on bail pending production of further evidence by the UK authorities. Suddenly, they were free. They quickly left Dublin and headed down to Fettered in County Tipperary, where they had a friend. They left Fettered and they travelled towards Dublin. As they approached Dublin, they veered south. They headed towards Wicklow, their old haunting ground from the robberies for which they'd been convicted, and they found their way to Britus Bay.
But the true extent of Shaw and Evans' evil was still unknown. It was not until they were interviewed by Detective Tom Connolly that the cold and ugly truth would begin to come to light. Gardaí believed, as it had been over a month since Elizabeth's disappearance, that there was probably little hope that she would be found unharmed. However, as Mary had only been missing for a comparatively short amount of time, hope for her well-being remained. The interviews with Shaw and Evans were now the detectives' last chance to find the girls.
At about 1:30 in the morning, Monday morning, I got a telephone call at home from, as he was at the time, Detective Inspector John Courtney, telling me about the arrest and to be in Galway as soon as I could the following morning. So I left home, went to Kildare, picked up, checked the Garda Team Kennedy. Both of us went to Eglinton Street Station in Galway. We arrived about 7:30 in the morning. We were first to arrive. Things were very quiet at the station. The two, Shaw and Evans, were in their cells. So I inquired to know if anybody had searched their place where they were staying. It was known at the time that they had a caravan which they were staying in at Barna, just outside Salt Hill. I asked, had anybody searched it? And the people who were there said, no, it's been preserved. Nobody has searched it. So I decided that possibly Mary Duffy could be in the caravan.
What they were about to uncover would become known as one of the most savage crimes in Ireland's history.
Pulled in behind it and had a look into the car to see who it was, because I knew it wasn't any neighbour's car or anything like that. So I had a look at the two gents in the car and I wrote down the number and the make of the car. And I went in home then and I made a cup of tea and then I brought my girlfriend home, but the car was gone. So approximately half an hour after I had first seen it, when I came out to bring my girlfriend home, the car had gone.
At that time, there was a program on the television that most people were watching called Roots, about the slavery in America. So I decided to go into the local pub and watch it, have a couple of pints. So at about 11:15, it was over, so I headed for home. Went in the door and went up the stairs, and the next thing I heard this awful scream. So I shouted down to Mary, I said, "Did you hear that?" So Mary went to the front door and saw a car pulling off. But we thought no more of it until we heard about the abduction the next day. It was just like a female in trouble, you know, high-pitched kind of a scream. But it never dawned on us that anything like that had happened until we heard it the next day.
We saw a girl on the road walking along. Geoff stopped the car. I got out and went over to the girl.
In 1976, I was just finishing primary school and moving into secondary school, and I guess it was also one of the hottest summers ever. 76. It was one of those summers that it just broke all records in the summertime, and in the wintertime it was one of the coldest winters ever. So it was a kind of a weird year, you know, a very for any 11-year-old child, kind of just. It's just one of those kind of landmark things that stand out in your life.
I grabbed a hold of her and dragged her to the car.
Mary Duffy was working as a waitress in the Wimpy bar close to the Telegraph offices here. It was a burger bar, and she worked there with several other girls. It was a very busy place because there were very few cafes as such in the town at that particular time.
John Shaw and Geoffrey Evans. Evidence now speculatively put them in and around the location where Elizabeth was last seen.
The investigation into Elizabeth Plunkett's disappearance continued for a number of weeks. In and around Feathered, in case they'd return, and in and around British Bay. Their description was circulated throughout the force, and it appeared in the media.
In the weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, Shaw and Evans tried to lay low in the west of Ireland. On the 14th of September, the two men approached the Barna Caravan Park caretaker in order to buy a caravan. They purchased one for £380, and for the receipt gave the names Roy Hall and David Ball. 1 week later, they moved the caravan to a quieter part of the park. The following day, Evans stole a 1970 Fern Green Ford Cortina in Clifton. In order to evade Gardaí, they hand-painted it black and changed the number plates.
It was a black box-shaped Cortina with a Dublin registration, and to me it seemed to have been hand-painted. Like, it didn't look like a finished product of paint, you know what I mean, like a garage would spray a car. It seemed to have been hand-painted, that's all I can say, you know.
With a nationwide investigation underway, numerous sightings of the peculiar Englishmen were reported to Gardaí, but Shaw and Evans had still managed to evade capture. Unaware that the Gardaí were closing in on them, the two men travelled to Castlebar late at night on the 22nd of September. It was on this night that Mary Duffy began the 20-minute walk home to Belcarra after work, expecting to be collected by her brother along the way. She never arrived home.
Mary Duffy was reported missing in around the 20th of September in 1976. Her disappearance was suspicious, and there was an alert sent out to keep an eye out for her.
I just heard about the abduction of Mary Duffy when I went into work the next morning. So when I inquired about what time,
people that Joe Nealon had spoken to in British Bay.
As the search and investigation continued in British Bay, a number of eyewitnesses came forward to help Gardaí piece together Elizabeth's last known movements. When a woman arrived at McDaniel's with her husband to pick up their son who had been working there that night, she saw Elizabeth leave the pub on her own. Shortly later, another motorist saw Elizabeth walking away from McDaniel's. He spotted a car that was driving in the opposite direction stop and pick up Elizabeth.
When we got to the wood, we dragged her out of the car. We climbed over a wire fence that was across the road there. We went into the woods with her. We had a hold of her. We put her to lie down, and she did so.
Suspicions arose about the two men Detective Nealon had encountered the day after Elizabeth's disappearance. These two men now became the focus of the investigation. Based on the information Detective Nealon had obtained, Gardaí travelled to Fethard to question Chris Outram as to the whereabouts of Geoffrey Murphy and his supposed brother. With them, they had the boots that had been found in the woods, the boots with the unusual brass screws.
So a few of us went down to Tipperary, down to Clonmel, where we went to see Chris Outram. Detective Inspector at the time, John Courtney, was in the group, and we interviewed Outram. The shoes or the boots were produced to him, and when he saw them, he says, "Oh, they're Geoffrey Evans's boots." He says, I recognise them, he says, because I repaired them for him in the prison in Dublin. So he then told the Gardaí that on Saturday, the 28th, the day that Elizabeth Plunkett was abducted from outside McDaniel's, that Geoffrey Evans's pal, a fellow by the name of John Shaw, borrowed a car from his friend, Outram's friend, and they went to Dublin. And they were away for a couple of days. And he says they came back here on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and they decided to leave.
That night, I was driving the patrol car. PJ Corkin was the observer. We were driving from Barna into Salt Hill. There was a disco on in the Ocean Wave hotel in Salt Hill. That was the first disco that was in Galway. There was a lot of cars parked outside it. We decided that we'd check the cars on both sides of the road. PJ was checking on the left-hand side, and I was checking on the right-hand side. As we went down the street, I noticed this car that we were looking for. We went down the street a little bit. We decided that PJ go to the station to ring Galway for help. We didn't want to talk over the radio to the station because a lot of youngsters around the place had walkie-talkies and they were listening to our messages. PJ decided to go down to the station, and I drove up a laneway up towards Seamount. I parked the car up there, and I could see the car down on the promenade. PJ was only gone a short time when two men came from the direction of the hotel where the disco was on, and I went into the car. So therefore, there was only just had to make up our mind there and then. I decided to tell the Galway car over the radio, come to Salt Hill as quick as you can. The two men got into the car and I was driving down. They couldn't pull out until I passed. I left the headlights on, full headlights. They were waiting for me to pass. I was in touch with the Galway car and I was asking them where they were. In the end, they said, "We're behind you now."
His pal, a fellow by the name of John Shaw, borrowed a car from his friend, Outham's friend, and they went to Dublin. And they were away for a couple of days. And he says they came back here on a Tuesday or Wednesday. And they decided to leave. And he says he drove them to Limerick on the 10th of September. And he didn't know where they were after that.
From this one piece of evidence, Gardaí now had the true identity of the two men they had been looking for. Englishmen John Shaw and Geoffrey Evans. Evidence now speculatively put them in and around the location where Elizabeth was last seen.
The investigation into Elizabeth Plunkett's disappearance continued for a number of weeks. In and around Feathered, in case they'd return, and in and around British Bay. Their description was circulated throughout the force and it appeared in the media.
In the weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, Shaw and Evans tried to lay low in the west of Ireland. On the 14th of September, the two men approached the Barna Caravan Park caretaker in order to buy a caravan. They purchased one for £380 and for the receipt gave the names Roy Hall and David Ball. 1 week later, they moved the caravan to a quieter part of the park. The following day, Evans stole a 1970 Fern Green Ford Cortina in Clifton. In order to evade Gardaí, they hand-painted it black and changed the number plates.
It was a black box-shaped Cortina with a Dublin registration. And to me, it seemed to have been hand-painted. Like it didn't look like a finished product of paint, you know what I mean? Like a garage would spray a car. It seemed to have been hand-painted, that's all I can say, you know.
With a nationwide investigation underway, numerous sightings of the peculiar Englishmen were reported to Gardaí, but Shaw and Evans had still managed to evade capture. Unaware that the Gardaí were closing in on them, the two men travelled to Castlebar late at night on the 22nd of September. It was on this night that Mary Duffy began the 20-minute walk home to Belcarra after work, expecting to be collected by her brother along the way. She never arrived home.
Mary Duffy was reported missing car, and I was asking them where they were. In the end, they said, "We're behind you now." I said, "When I'll get out of the car," I said to the Galway lads, "When I get out of the car, I'll catch the driver and let you catch the passenger." I got out of the car, caught the driver. PJ and the Galway lads caught the passenger. They were caught just like that.
They were brought to Eglinton Street Garda Station and they were detained for possession of a stolen car.
Shaw and Evans, who had told Garda Boland their names were Hall and Ball, were moved from Salt Hill Station to Eglinton Street 1 hour after they were arrested. They were detained in their cells until early the next morning, when a series of interviews were conducted. The Gardaí interrogated the suspects until they revealed their true identities and criminal past.
Geoffrey Evans and John Shaw were both in their 30s when they arrived in Ireland in 1974. They were already on the run. They were wanted for questioning in the UK in connection with 3 savage sexual assaults which had happened to women in and around the Manchester area where they were from. John Shaw was a former miner. He was powerfully built, dark, brooding individual. He already had 26 previous convictions, including 2 for sexual assault. Geoffrey Evans was the more intelligent of the 2. He also had a string of convictions as long as your arm. He had spent a considerable amount of time in prison already. He was the more cunning and he was the dominant figure in their evil partnership.
Shaw and Evans came to Ireland on the run from the English police. In order to support themselves here, their criminal tendencies began once again.
They needed 2 things. They needed money and they needed transport. To that end, they travelled down to Wicklow and carried out a number of burglaries, mostly on households. But the burglaries were bungled and they were quickly caught by the Gardaí, brought to the courts, convicted and sent to prison. Now, at this stage, the British authorities heard about their arrest and the fact that they were in prison, and they began to initiate extradition proceedings against them.
Wednesday night, the 22nd of September.
I was at the cinema in Westport with my mother and my girlfriend, and when I arrived home to drive into my driveway, I noticed a car across the driveway. It was completely unusual because no one ever parked, for all the years I lived there, ever parked across my driveway. So on seeing the car there, I pulled in behind it and had a look into the car to see who it was, because I knew it wasn't any neighbour's car or anything like that. So I had a look at the 2 gents in the car, and I wrote down the number and the make of the car. And I went in home then, and I made a cup of tea, and then I brought my girlfriend home, but the car was gone. So approximately half an hour after I had first seen it, when I came out to bring my girlfriend home, the car had gone.
At that time, there was a program on the television that most people were watching called Roots, about the slavery in America. So I decided to go into the local pub and watch it, have a couple of pints. So at about 11:15, it was over, so I headed for home. Went in the door and went up the stairs, and the next thing I heard this awful scream. So I shouted down to Mary, I said, "Did you hear that?" So Mary went to the front door and saw a car pulling off. But we thought no more of it until we heard about the abduction the next day. It was just like a female in trouble, high-pitched kind of a scream. But it never dawned on us that anything like that had happened until we heard it the next day.
We saw a girl on the road walking along. Jeff stopped the car. I got out and went over to the girl.
In 1976, I was just finishing primary school and moving into secondary school, and I guess it was also one of the hottest summers ever. 76. It was one of those summers that it just broke all records. in the summertime, and in the wintertime it was one of the coldest winters ever. So it was a kind of
the All-Ireland football final. The Dublin defeated Kerry. I remember it well. That night, at 11:30, Jim Boland, Garda Jim Boland, and Garda Corcoran of Salt Hill, they saw the car parked in the promenade near a hotel. So they kept it under observation, and they contacted the Gardaí in Galway for assistance.
PJ Corcoran and myself, we were working in Salt Hill that night. Early that night, PJ and I, we were in the patrol car, and we said that we'd have to keep an eye out for those two English guys, that it'd be terrible if they were living in our area and we didn't know it. That night, I was driving the patrol car. PJ Corcoran was the observer. We were driving from Barna into Salt Hill. There was a disco on in the Ocean Wave hotel in Salt Hill. That was the first disco that was in Galway. There was a lot of cars parked outside it. We decided that we'd check the cars on both sides of the road. PJ was checking on the left-hand side, and I was checking on the right-hand side. As we went down the street, I noticed this car that we were looking for. We went down the street a little bit. We decided that PJ go to the station to ring Galway for help. We didn't want to talk over the radio to the station because a lot of youngsters around the place had walkie-talkies and they were listening to our messages. PJ decided to go down to the station, and I drove up a laneway up towards Seamount. I parked the car up there.
I grabbed a hold of her and dragged her to the car.
Mary Duffy was working as a waitress in the Wimpy bar close to the County-Telegraph offices here. It was a burger bar, and she worked there with several other girls. It was a very busy place because there were very few cafes as such in the town at that particular time, and it was a regular meeting place for quite a lot of people, and all the journalists here used to go there on a regular basis, and we knew Mary. She was a lovely girl, very helpful, very pleasant, and as I said, the shock of it just numbed everybody.
She started to scream. I pulled her into the back of the car and sat beside her. She told me her name was Mary.
Mary Duffy finished work in the Wimpy bar late on that particular night, around 11:30, maybe coming up to 12 o'clock. She telephoned her brother, or her home, to get her brother to come and collect her, as he normally would. As it so happened, he was gone somewhere else in the car, dropping somebody else home somewhere. And she was told that when he come back, he'd go and collect her. So in the meantime, she started to walk.
They must have been watching the kiosk across the road where she was making her phone call from. Mary Duffy made a phone call from a kiosk across the road, and that kiosk was visible from my driveway.
I think my first memory of Mary Duffy was, I think she worked in a shop on Castle Street, which was just below the boxing club, a place called Stewart's. And it was a little shop that I remember you walked down these kind of rounded steps, and you kind of walked down into the shop, And then when you got to the shop, you stepped down another level, and it was a tiny little shop, and Mary was there, and there was a 99 machine there. And so, lots of kids spent time in there,
Please, please!
She wasn't gone too far when two men, apparently Sean Evans, pulled up beside her in the car. One of them got out, dragged her back to the car, put her into the car. During the struggle, she screamed and she lost a set of dentures, which were subsequently found a day or two afterwards and identified by her dentist as being belonged to Mary Duffy.
Because at the time I used to work.
Two men, Englishmen, as he said, drove in and got petrol. He told him, he had read the papers, he had read about the description of the two Englishmen that were missing, or that were wanted, the two Englishmen that were wanted, in relation to the disappearance of two girls. And took the number of their car, and he noted it was a Ford car, and it was hand-painted black. And he noted the number down in some document in the pub, and the following day he reported it to the guards. Now, it was a big search, and this sighting of this car and the number was circulated again throughout the force. The following Sunday night, which was the 26th of September, it was the night of the All-Ireland football final. The Dublin defeated Kerry. I remember it well. That night, at 11:30, Jim Boland, Garda Jim Boland, and Garda Corcoran of Salt Hill, they saw the car parked in the promenade near a hotel. So they kept it under observation, and they contacted the Gardaí in Galway for assistance.
PJ Corcoran and myself, we were working in Salt Hill that night. Early that night, PJ and I, we were in the patrol car, and we said that we'd have to keep an eye out for those two English guys, that it'd be terrible if they were living in our area and we didn't know it. That night, I was driving the patrol car. PJ Corcoran was the observer. We were driving from Barna into Salt Hill. There was a disco on in the Ocean Wave hotel in Salt Hill. That was the first disco that was in Galway.